Really glad to have you for the Tuesday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Got a lot to talk about again today. We always have a lot to talk about, but it's going to be fun. Kamala Harris last week said Biden shouldn't have run in 2024. Now, magically, another member of that administration who also has presidential ambitions, I'm sure it's just a coincidence, Pete Buttigieg, essentially saying the same thing. It's almost like there's a whole process to this, Jim. We'll also take a look at some curious comments from Attorney General Pam Bondi. A lot of people are furious, of course, at how many people on the left have responded to the murder of Charlie Kirk. But there are certain constitutional provisions we still have to pay attention to. And so it's important that she pays attention to those as well, since she's, the top law enforcement official in the United States. And so, but we're going to start with the latest in the investigation, the latest in the case of the assassination of Charlie Kirk out there in Utah. Of course, we mentioned on Friday that the alleged killer is in custody. The evidence that seems to have piled up since then is growing mightily. There's even now DNA from the site of where the shooting took place, and on it goes. It appears that they have a very strong case. In fact, even a potential confession on Discord from the killer. But weirdly, for quite a while, because the killer himself wasn't trans, and because the killer grew up in a Republican family and was taught how to use guns, the left and the media just decided, hey, this guy's actually on the right. This guy's actually on the right. Turns out maybe he just didn't think Charlie Kirk would far right enough. Maybe he's a Nick Fuentes type guy. And Spencer Cox, who's no friend of Donald Trump, by the way, the governor of Utah, is out there saying he was from the left. Actually, turns out he's dating a guy who's transitioning to being a woman. And so your colleague over at National Review, Jeff Blahar, has had enough. And he says, there was all this speculation before the arrest. I guess that makes sense. Some of the speculation came from people's various interpretations of what was written on those unspent casings. But Jeff says, I can't understand any of this after Tyler Robinson was caught on Friday morning. At that point, mere ignorance and wish casting turned into an active disinformation campaign, and it was particularly appalling to see from people whose civic responsibility it is to know better. To take one example, how about the repellent Eric Swalwell, who on Friday afternoon said, quote, it doesn't matter that Kirk's killer was a straight white male or that he was from a Republican family that voted for Donald Trump. Violence has never been the answer. And of course, Jeff then calls him a moral reprobate, which is certainly true on a number of levels. So, Jim, the left has tried to get ahead of this as, no, he was actually far right. He wasn't all these things on the left that we were fearing in the first place or connected to people, whether it's transgender or anything else. So what do you make of the left's efforts to confuse people and Jeff's counterpunch here?
So we saw this almost from the beginning when I wrote something that talked about the idea of this being, America having a tacit acceptance of left-wing violence. Jim, we haven't even caught the guy. How can you possibly know that this was left-wing violence? And correct, I do not know how the shooter felt about campaign finance reform. I do not know how the shooter felt about tariffs. I do know that the shooter believed that Charlie Kirk should not be allowed to speak and that he should die for what he believes in and what he was saying. I don't think that's a crazy assumption based on this. I think that, the context of the shooting makes pretty clear, to go through my routine. It's not a lover's quarrel, wasn't an attempted robbery, wasn't road rage, right? We can guess certain things from the context of this shooting. Which, was it conceivably possible that this was someone who was on the far, far right and as a result of it believed that Charlie Kirk wasn't on? Conceivably, I suppose, but I'm a big believer in Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is usually the one that is most likely. And I kind of, there's been this almost since the beginning, really picked up speed in the last day or two. People might be asking, why is this in the Good Martini, besides Jeff's excellent, rebuke of this? I don't think it's going to work. And I think, this effort to gaslight, this effort to rewrite history, however you want to characterize it. Look, this is only going to work on people who have really not paid any attention to the coverage of Charlie Kirk's assassination. And I figure that has to be a very small segment of the population of those who bother to consume news. And if you are paying attention, you've probably seen all the coverage indicating that, look, do we know every iota of how this guy saw the world? No, but we can know pretty darn far that it's extremely likely he did not like what Charlie Kirk was saying and wanted him silenced from a perspective of the left. Does this mean the Democrat down the street or your Democratic coworker or neighbor is responsible? No, it does not. Yes, this was a person on the left. And I don't think that the Lawrence tribes of the world, he's a Harvard professor who was really embracing this theory and spreading it as far and wide as possible. First of all, you, the news consumer, should notice when something like this happens, who decides to put out what is a rumor, what is an unconfirmed report, what is something that doesn't quite line up with common sense, and who takes the ball and runs with it, and who does, I'm sorry for the football metaphor for Jets and Bears fans out there, but like who basically just wants to put information out there without checking to say, does that seem right? Does that sound right? Does that, you should think about who's reliable here. And the other thing is, we've talked about this concept of a bubble or an echo chamber. Look, there are folks on the left who are now absolutely convinced that the shooter was a Nick Fuentes follower or a groyper or a right-wing maniac or something. By the way, I do think you can point out that anybody who's taking this kind of action, that it's not merely standard left-wing politics, that there's definitely a certain amount of nihilism. There's definitely, this is, definitely a certain like darkness in their soul who believes that, yes, violence is absolutely totally acceptable, and that's not standard on the left, although it's not nearly as rare as we'd like it to be. But yeah, so this is, like kudos to Jeff, but also I don't think this is going to work. I think it's just too contrary both to what is known, what is evidence, what's being covered out there, that you can't gaslight people into believing that, Charlie Kirk got killed in some sort of right-on-right intramural, spat, gang violence or something.
Yeah, no, the evidence is piling up. There was some confusion, obviously, before we knew who the killer was. You can't have a motive until you figure out who the killer is, but they had found the casings when they found the gun and all that stuff, so evidence was trickling in, and then the more you put it together, it becomes pretty obvious what was going on here. And so the left, they'll deny what they said. They have footage of J.B. Pritzker, the Illinois governor, out there saying, I never called anybody a Nazi. And then there's clips of him going, this is just like Nazi Germany. This is just like Nazi Germany, talking about the Trump administration. And so I think they realize this is a story that's not going away after 72 or 96 hours. Yeah. This is a story that's really going to change the landscape of American politics for a considerable amount of time, maybe long term. And they're trying to figure out how to play that. And they're not doing very well. And the right answer would be to stop being insane, which is not easy for them, obviously. So, all right. Well, much better news than the left's efforts to completely lie about the situation there is the fantastic mattresses you're going to get from Brooklyn Bedding. Mrs. Columbus and I, like we've said, absolutely love the Aurora Luxe cooling mattress from the moment we first lugged it up the stairs, because it comes very tightly vacuum sealed, and then you plug it up to your box spring, and then you open it up and it just inflates. It's amazing how that works, first of all. And then you just lay on it and it's like, oh, this is the perfect mattress. And then you sleep on it for a night and 2 nights and a week and 2 weeks and now a month. And it just is fantastic. I always have a great night's sleep and I'm not sore when I wake up. I really love Brooklyn Bedding.
Greg, in that last just martini, we discussed all the nonsense being spread around out there. And you want to ask these people, how do you sleep at night? Of course, you could sleep better at night with Brooklyn Bedding. Because of Brooklyn Bedding, they know sleep isn't one size fits all. Maybe you're a heavy sleeper. Maybe you're a light sleeper. Maybe you like it warm. Maybe you like it cold. They offer mattresses for everybody with every sleep style, even in a hard-to-find size. Let's say you've got an enormous bed or you've got a really tiny bed. They can find one for you. If you're not sure which mattress is right for you, they have a Brooklyn Bedding sleep quiz, and you can find your perfect match in under 2 minutes.
Yeah, so go to brooklynbedding.com and use our promo code 3ML at checkout to get 30% off site-wide. This offer is not available anywhere else. That's brooklynbedding.com and use the promo code 3ML for 30% off site-wide. Make sure you enter our show name after you check out so they know that we sent you. All right, Jim, more on the fallout from the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And we talked on Friday, and you wrote about in the Morning Jolt yesterday what you label consequence culture. The critics of this want to call it cancel culture, of course. And but this is in response to people who are celebrating the death of Charlie Kirk, and so much so that they decided to put it out there on social media for the entire world to see. And so people who are horrified that people would react to a public murder like this, and a young white wife being widowed and 2 young kids being fatherless now, they said, oh, well, it says right there in your bio that you work here. I bet your employer would love to see this. And turns out some of these people are being fired. It gets even more disturbing, like we've said, when it's teachers of young school children or college professors or doctors and this sort of thing. And so there have been professional consequences. Now, that's different than being prosecuted for your speech by the government. There's this thing called the Bill of Rights, and the very First Amendment has the freedom of speech. And so there are some specific areas like slander or threats and inciting violence and that sort of thing that can be prosecuted. But reacting even in the most hideous ways to things is not a thing that can be prosecuted under the First Amendment of our Constitution. And so here is what Attorney General Pam Bondi was suggesting, though, very contrary to that, on the Katie Miller podcast yesterday.
There's free speech and then there's hate speech. And there is no place, especially now, especially after what happened to Charlie, in our society.
Do you see more law enforcement going after these groups who are using hate speech and putting cuffs on people so we show them that some action is better than no action?
We will absolutely target you, go after you, if you are targeting anyone with hate speech, anything. And that's across the aisle.
And then there's the issue of the employment debate, which people have been having, including us. And here's what she said about that in a separate interview.
That's horrific. It's free speech, but you shouldn't be employed anywhere if you're going to say that. And employers, you have an obligation to get rid of people. You need to look at people who are saying horrible things, and they shouldn't be working with you. Businesses cannot discriminate. If you want to go in and print posters with Charlie's pictures on them for a vigil, you have to let them do that. We can prosecute you for that. I have Harmeet Dillon right now in our civil rights unit looking at that immediately, that Office Depot had done that. We're looking at that.
And so, Jim, the issue here is that even the most disgusting speech is protected by the First Amendment as long as it doesn't go into those areas that, threaten other people's liberties and so forth. So what do you make of Pam Bondi, who's understandably distraught, but that doesn't change what her job is and what the Constitution says?
Let me first say that if there's a government official that does not understand how the First Amendment works, that does not understand that under the law there is no thing defined as hate speech, and that yes, there are certain types of speech that could get you into trouble with the law, but there's a very high bar that must to be met. It's not, some guy saying at a football game, "I'm going to kill the ref," is not considered a threat against the life of the referee. It's got to be very specific, and it really has to be a situation where there's a very reasonable expectation that you or someone else will act upon that particular desire to harm someone in the speech. The speech itself is very rarely the actual issue when charges are brought. Now with Bondi here, if you're going to have a government official not understand this, it's not good if, say, the Secretary of HUD or Labor or Transportation gets this wrong. But it's much, much worse when it's the Attorney General. It's much, much worse when it's the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the United States. And my colleague Charlie Kirk just takes her to the woodshed today, just explaining all of these things and past Supreme Court decisions and the fact, what's particularly gut-wrenchingly ironic here is when she says, free speech, there's no such thing as hate speech, or she's saying that we'll target you if you're using hate speech. That was the argument from the left for the last 10 years, and it was that the First Amendment doesn't protect this stuff. The Supreme Court has already been very clear on this. The First Amendment does protect this stuff. And then just on the question of whether something is consequence culture or cancel culture. The consequence culture, at least first time I came across it, was used by LeVar Burton. He was appearing on The View. And he made the argument that, look, consequences are finally encompassing everybody in society, whereas they haven't ever in this country. Now, look, if you go join the Klan, I think your employer has every right in the world to say, we don't want you working here. Or you can leave the Klan or you can work here, but you can't do both. As I wrote in yesterday's Jolt, I think it's entirely reasonable for employee. If your employee posts something saying, "I'm glad Charlie Kirk got killed," maybe they're a great brain surgeon and you don't want to lose them from the hospital or something. But you really, at minimum, I think you really got to sit them down and say, you really can't say stuff like that and keep working here. You really need to change. You probably need a mental health professional. You're not supposed to go around feeling good when terrible things happen to other people, even if you politically disagree with them. And if that is what gives meaning and happiness and purpose in your life, you're really deeply troubled, and you need to look at life differently. So I'll leave it to employers. I don't like the Attorney General going on television and saying you, the employer, are obligated to do this sort of thing. But so she, look, this is a very bad situation. It's very bad that so many people have so little control over their emotions, that they have so much hate in their heart that they feel they need to put this out online for the whole wide world to see. I think when an employer is in that situation, they have a very tough decision, and they really need to say to the, like I said, there's got to be some intervention, whether or not it's firing. But it's not the job of the Attorney General to come in and say, yes, you have to fire these people. Like, this is, utter obliviousness to all previous past case law and this sort of thing. And that's like kind of your job as Attorney General. So I saw somebody else looking at this, a conservative who has a very, consistent traditional understanding of the Constitution, looked at this, looked at the previous mess with the Epstein documents from earlier this year, and looked at Pam Bondi and said, that's strike two. Doesn't mean she's got to go, but this is, two really major screw ups, and it's September, and you really just, you want to have as few of these as possible from your Attorney General. She may backtrack. She posted something this morning emphasizing that she meant threats, but that's not really what she was saying in those appearances. She was saying hate speech. Words matter, particularly when you're Attorney General.
Well, that's true. And like you said before, basically people were excusing the murder of Charlie Kirk because they chalked up everything he said that they didn't agree with as hate speech. If you believe that men can't become women, that's hate speech. If you believe that, there's the right to life for the unborn, well, that's hate speech towards women. If you think that people should be deported if they're in the country illegally, that's hate speech. You're being very, very cruel to those people. Whatever the line is on the right that they don't want to hear, that's hate speech. So you don't want to be doing the same thing in the opposite direction. Hopefully she has learned her lesson. The other good news here is that Harmeet Dillon is one of the best appointments that we've got in this administration, particularly in the Justice Department. And I don't think she would go down that direction. I think she knows that very, very well, having defended so many other people on the right over the years for being accused of frivolous things in that area. So hopefully this was just an emotional outburst, but you can't do that when you're the highest Justice Department official in the country. All right. Well, let's talk about your business, because whether Pam Bondi thinks you should be firing people, depending on what they say or not, your number one concern at your business, of course, is putting out quality products and services, but also planning for the future. And some of that is under your control and some of it's not. You don't know what the market's going to do. You don't know what the Fed's going to do with interest rates. You're not sure what inflation's going to do. But when it comes to making sure you take care of those things that have got to get done, but you don't really want to do them, but can be done through AI, do it. And do it through NetSuite by Oracle, the number one cloud ERP, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, and HR into one fluid platform.
Hey, Greg, when you want to know what your future holds, who do you go see? At Oracle. 42,000 businesses have future-proofed their business with NetSuite by Oracle, the number one cloud ERP, which brings accounting, financial management, inventory, and HR all into one fluid platform. With one unified business management suite, you have one source of truth. Rest in peace, Robert Redford, for the awfully titled movie Truth, in which he played Dan Rather, the second straight movie in which he played a agent of Hydra. But this one source of truth will give you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions with NetSuite by Oracle.
Yeah, and speaking of getting the most out of your opportunities, download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/martini. The guide is free to you at netsuite.com/martini. That's netsuite.com/martini. All right, Jim, on to our crazy martini now. And we've talked about this a couple of times, but it's just so funny. We talked on Friday about how Kamala Harris released that excerpt from her book Through the Atlantic, where she said, was it loyalty or recklessness by letting just Joe and Jill make the decision about whether he runs for re-election? In hindsight, it was reckless. And well, now that she has said that, apparently it's okay for other people to say that. You'd think that she and others might have said it when those other books came out earlier this year, but no, it's got to happen with her book. And I guess Pete Buttigieg doesn't have a book coming out right now because he's decided to just piggyback on Kamala Harris. when he was asked about this on Meet the Press over the weekend by Kristen Welker on Meet the Press.
I have to ask you about this new book, Vice President Kamala Harris. We are starting to see some excerpts. She writes about President Biden's decision to run for re-election, and she says this, quote, "It's Joe and Jill's decision. We all said that like a mantra, as if we'd all been hypnotized. Was it grace or was it recklessness? In retrospect, I think it was recklessness." You were in the president's cabinet, of course. Do you believe it was recklessness for President Biden's inner circle not to intervene sooner?
He should not have run. And if he had made that decision sooner, we might have been better off. But it literally was his decision. Nobody else was able to make that decision. And now in front of us, we're confronted with the decisions that come next, whether that's inside of a political party or movement, or as we're all weighing right now, in our own lives as Americans, as a country. And that's where we've got to focus.
He's so good at putting in so many words that have nothing to do with the question. It's just amazing. But then she follows up, did you ever speak out and urge him not to run? And was it recklessness on behalf of the people who didn't do so? So putting a little bit of pressure on him. He says, I wasn't included in the process of deciding whether the president should run again. And so he's absolving himself. I don't see that she asked him about whether he ever observed Biden being impaired. And if he didn't, because I'm sure that would have made news if he would have said it. Here we go again with him and Harris saying, it's so obvious he shouldn't have run. Even though he was doing a great job, it was perfectly clear to me that he was capable to do the job, which is completely inconsistent.
So, Greg, I don't know about you. Every time we play Buttigieg clips, no matter what he's saying, I am hearing, at McKinsey, we believe that problem and opportunity are two sides of the same coin. Please give us money. For Obama, notice he's got that full beard coming in?
Yeah, he's trying to look more than 22.
Well, I was going to say, one, is this prepping to go head-to-head with J.D. Vance, right? Like, all of a sudden, J.D. Vance is the beard trend center among politicians. Two, the Donald Trump statement, America is never going to elect Alfred E. Newman as president. Like, I think that stung. I think he felt that. I think he kind of looked in the mirror and said, okay, I do kind of look like Alfred E. Newman. If I grow a beard, no one will think, I will no longer have to show ID when I go to buy beer at the liquor store. So I'm going to use two terms that are kind of interrelated: preference cascade and permission structure. And, preference cascade is when one person says they like something, and that causes other people to say, oh, I like that too. And there's kind of this idea of it gains, it's how things spread virally and things like that. Permission structure is a little bit interesting. Where, like, let's say you want to do something, but you feel like other people may not approve. Let's say buy a Cybertruck, since I feel like I'm seeing them in my neighborhood a lot. You're like, I kind of like them. They're kind of cool looking, but everybody thinks they look like the truck that I drew when I was in kindergarten. And people don't like Elon Musk, and some people try to firebomb them and stuff like that. So you're going back and forth, and then you see somebody else in your neighborhood buy a Cybertruck, and you're like, well, okay, that person's not getting firebombed. That person's not getting too much grief from the neighbors. That's okay. And then the next person does. And with each person that get one, like the first person getting one has created permission for the next person to say, okay, I was thinking about it, I'll do it there. The declaration that Joe Biden is in really bad shape and should not run for that was obvious for like 4 years, you could argue, right? So
oh, sure.
You and I were talking about this since at least after Afghanistan, when he didn't talk for like several days, when the whole country was like, what's going on? But the entire 4 years, he was only doing appearances between 10 and 4, rambling, appear-doddering. Now we found out from the books he was forgetting people's names and losing his train of thought in cabinet meetings and things like that. So what we clearly have, the only person who saw permission to say Joe Biden is too old to run for another term is Dean Phillips. We talked about oracles earlier. There's a little bit of Cassandra. There's a little bit of like Dean Phillips is the guy who saw that planet Krypton was about to explode, and nobody wanted to listen to him. Nobody wanted to, pay attention to that. Biden drops out. All of a sudden, we get all these little anecdotes coming out. Harris loses the election. We get even more of it. And Kamala Harris, in really very mild terms, like, she still says he was competent to serve another 4 years, but she also says that it was reckless to leave the decision to him. Well, now it's okay. Now everybody come out and say, oh, yeah, I always thought this was a terrible idea. Oh, yeah, I was never on board with this. It is kind of like, it's interesting that Buttigieg, of all people, like, he's the youngest guy in the cabinet. He's the youngest guy in the 2020 field. You'd think he'd be the guy who's best positioned to make an age-related argument. And yet he did not for the entirety of the time he was Secretary of Transportation. In fact, the one guy who did in the 2020 presidential campaign, Julian Castro, the former HUD secretary and from Texas, San Antonio mayor, he got cast to the Phantom Zone, to use my second Superman reference of this segment. And just like he's in the witness protection program, you just can't find the guy anywhere. Like that's how there was this enforcement of that. You could not run around and say Joe Biden has memory issues and Joe Biden is too old to be president. Well, now it's okay. So like there's this dynamic in our politics where it's not just enough to be right. Because I think you, me, and a whole bunch of other conservatives feel like we've been right about a lot of things over the years. Lab leak. And what the problem is, you can't be right about it too early. There's an appropriate time to be right about this. It's when the permission structure has been established. And in this case, you had to wait for Kamala Harris to say that Biden shouldn't run for a second term. And then it became morally acceptable to say that. If you did it before, it was taboo.
Yeah, no, it's incredible. And, what do you want in a president? Both of these people want to be president. Both of them may not run, but you want a leader. You want someone who's not afraid to tell you the hard truths and someone who will speak truth to other power. Both of these people just cowered and went along. So it's not exactly a ringing endorsement, even if you do like their policies, which of course we don't. But these are not leaders. These are not people who are going to shoot straight with the American people. They were covering up for Joe Biden for 4 years. And beyond until this month.
If you're Buttigieg, your odds of winning the 2028 nomination aren't great. I don't think you covered yourself in glory as Secretary of Transportation. You may be in better situation to play the guy who's like, I always thought this was a bad idea. I joined the team because I thought it was the best way to help out, to prevent bad outcomes. Ultimately, I was powerless. Nobody wanted to listen to me. Like somebody said, the subtitle of every Washington memoir is "If Only They Had Listened to Me."
Yes,
this is when Buttigieg should come out with this and say, "I always thought Harris was a terrible candidate." Like go out and go smoke scorched earth on everybody who's part of the past, so you look like the guy who could be part of the future. I don't know if it would work, but I also feel like just this, playing second fiddle to Harris on Biden shouldn't have run doesn't really distinguish him or make him stand out in any way.
Yeah, looks very weak. Oh, yeah, I agree with that. So
me too.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Don't forget me, guys. Yeah, I always thought it was a bad idea too.
Yeah, well,
this yipping chihuahua of
it's a good way to put him. Yeah, anything that makes Pete Buttigieg look worse is fine with me. Anyway, Jim, happy Tuesday. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow, Greg.
Jim Garrity, National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks so much for being with us today. Please be sure to subscribe to the 3 Martini Lunch podcast if you don't already, and tell your friends about us as well. Thanks for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. Get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch podcast. Follow us both on X. He's at Jim Garrity. I'm at Greg Corombos. Have a terrific Tuesday. Join us again Wednesday for the 3 Martini Lunch.